to Broadband Breakfast Live Online. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. Very happy to welcome you to this exciting discussion today around pole attachments. And who wouldn't want to talk about pole attachment? It is one of the most important and exciting topics, and I am quite serious about that. But before we get to each of our guests and to a little bit more about our program, I want to highlight a couple of things that are going on. The first, of course, is that we've been doing this for more than 2 years. Every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern Time, we run Broadband Breakfast Live Online. We've been doing it since the pandemic started. We will continue, and we encourage you to check this page, broadbandbreakfast.com/BBLO. You can always find the most up-to-date listing, and we do change them. We add them. We strive to adapt to topical and newsy issues. So we hope you'll check that page and be with us. The other thing that's happening, very excited to make sure everyone knows, it's been announced, but the day is upon us. Monday through Thursday of next week is Broadband Communities Summit in Houston, Texas. I've been going to this conference for about 15 years. Every year, it's one of the regular events I go to. And this year, for the third year in a row, Broadband Breakfast will be convening an event jointly with Broadband Community Summit. It's called Digital Infrastructure Investment, DII, or Digital Infrastructure Investment. That event will be for the third time in a row at Broadband Communities. It will be at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday, just 5 days from now. And this is the first. We will be streaming digital infrastructure investment for free. You just need to register to sign up to attend digital infrastructure investment. And we hope you will, because we have two very, very exciting sessions at the program. The first session will be on public financing. Sorry, I got that wrong. The first session will be on private financing, and the second session will be on public financing. And we're going to be talking about the evolution of ownership models and in the digital infrastructure space. And this conference as a whole, Digital Infrastructure Investments, brings the financial services community jointly with the broadband operators community. And we've been doing that again for 3 years now. We're very excited about it. We are also excited about our sponsors for digital infrastructure investment. They include Broadband Now, Pinpoint Capital Advisors, Render Networks, Sci-Fi Networks, Utopia Fiber, Positron Access, and the California Emerging Technology Fund. Thank you to the sponsors of Digital Infrastructure Investment 2022. And I also want to give a shout out to all of our other sponsors as well for Broadband Breakfast Live Online. They allow us to do this programming every single week on Wednesday at 12 noon. In addition to the sponsors I mentioned, we have Broadband Money, Powerhouse Management, Connect to the Future, Lightbox, Ookla, and Samsung. Those are the rest of our sponsors for Broadband Breakfast Live Online. We thank them. Now let's turn to our discussion. This discussion today is about pole attachments. Well, what are pole attachments? I think most of you know, but for those of you who don't, they apply to the process of getting wires for wire-based communication on poles, as well as ducts, conduits, and the like. And today we are in an excellent position to learn about, and dare I suspect, hear a little bit of controversy about pole attachments. We have 5 panelists with us. Let me go ahead and open the view up to all of them, making sure that you all have an opportunity to see them. I'm going to give each of them 5 minutes to make some opening statements, remarks, and tee up our discussion. And then we're going to talk through it. We're going to see if there are any issues that we can all agree on. And I'm not sure, maybe not. Before, well, let me introduce our panelists, and then I'll ask a question that I know John wants to answer. Our panelists, and they will speak in this order, are John Windhausen. John is the executive director of the school's Health and Libraries Broadband Coalition. Welcome, John. He'll be followed by REA Fishman. REA is the Associate General Counsel of the Edison Electric Institute, trade group for utilities. Following REA will be Edward Lopez, and Edward is a professor at Western Carolina University. He's done some amazing studies on pole attachments. I was reading through them last night, poring over them, and boy, he's got some comprehensive data on it, and I look forward to hearing his summary of that. Following Edward will be Cheryl Riggs. Thank you, Cheryl, for joining us for the first time. Cheryl's the CEO of the Utilities Technology Council. I'll let her speak to their role in this space and their perspective on the issue, but thank you for being with us, Cheryl. And then batting cleanup, fifth on our baseball team here, will be our speaker, Mark Paul. And Mark is in a role as Vice President of Policy for Charter Communications. So thank you to each of you for making time to be part of this discussion. And as I just said, as I turn now to John Winhausen, I want to make sure that he is able to address a looming question about this issue, which is to say, is pole attachments simply an issue of where you stand is where you sit? Are the interests just driven by where you're at, what lobbying group or entity you're with? Or are there any principles? Let's call these veil of ignorance principles from John Rawls' model of thinking about how we would design principles if we didn't know what role we would have when we came into life or when we came into this issue. So John, with that tee up, let's turn it over to you and hear from you for up to 5 minutes on your thoughts on this topic.
Well, that's great, Drew. Thank you very much for that opening and introduction. So yes, I am going to do my best to bring out the veil of ignorance out of the shadows and into the limelight here. And the reason I think I'm in a good position to try to do that is because that's who we are. So you mentioned that Schools, Health and Libraries Broadband Coalition. We also call ourselves the Shelby Coalition for short. And we are a very broad-based public interest organization with over 300 members from all across the United States. So we obviously have a lot of schools and libraries, but a lot of public interest groups, consulting firms, private sector companies, research and education networks. And our goal is to provide high capacity broadband for anchor institutions and their communities. So some have asked me, well, why does Shelby care about pole attachments? And the reason is, as you teed it up, Drew, it's so vitally important to getting broadband everywhere. And as we started to talk with our members about 2 years ago, we started to hear stories from our research and education network members and friends. So folks like Kinber in Pennsylvania and Merritt in Michigan, who said they're trying to drive broadband deeper into more rural communities, but they keep coming up against this stumbling block of pole attachment rates and delays. And so we started to investigate further and realized, this is a real barrier to the anchor institutions getting served. So we saw examples, for instance, in Socorro County, New Mexico, that has rural school districts that haven't been able to get broadband access because of the pole attachment difficulties. We've seen in Utah, Utopia had to sue the city of American Fork in Utah for violating the agreement. They thought they had a pole attachment agreement, and then the city, didn't follow through on that agreement. So I know, Drew, you've publicized that dispute already in Broadband Breakfast, and that's still ongoing. But it's not just one-sided. I was reading an article preparing for this conversation, an article from Chris Mitchell talking about how a lot of local municipalities are trying to deploy broadband, and they're running into, in Kentucky in particular, to use the Kentucky wired network, and they're running into, the municipalities are running into pole attachment problems. So this is not by sector. We're not blaming any one particular sector for these problems. This is really the issue that we're concerned about. We're not, pro anybody or anti anybody. We're pro everybody. We want more broadband to be deployed. And our basic philosophy is the biggest problem in this country has not been overbuilding, it's underbuilding. We have not been investing enough to solve the digital divide. When you go back to the National Broadband Plan that came out in 2010, it had a lot of goals that we were supposed to reach by the year 2020. And unfortunately, we didn't accomplish a lot of those goals. We made progress, but we didn't get the job done. So it really speaks to, we need to change our way of thinking and be more aggressive. And pole attachments is one of those areas that is a big stumbling block and a hurdle. So we're very pleased that the FCC has launched this proceeding. The Shelby Coalition last year put together a set of principles. And getting back to your philosophical question, we put together principles calling for non-discrimination, cost-based rates, and expedited pole attachment processes. And we really think these principles could be a good guide for not just the FCC, but also NTIA as it administers the BEAD program and other funding programs, the Treasury Department, state and local governments as well. So we're trying to move the ball forward and try to create a collective consensus about the need to address these pole attachment issues on a more comprehensive basis, because that's the only way we're going to get this job done, of getting all the anchor institutions and their communities connected. So I'd say that's my overall message, but we've heard again and again from our members that the costs of pole attachments can be between 20% and 50% of the net costs of the network build. And, and sometimes that is just too high. If we really want to get broadband everywhere, especially out to these high-cost rural communities, we have to find a way to bring those pole attachment rates down to more cost-based levels. So thank you, Drew. I'll stop there for now.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks for picking up on the philosophical reference and running with it. Let's turn now to REA Fishman at EEI. The floor is yours.
Hi, good morning. I'm REA Fishman. And again, just to introduce EEI, we are the trade association for the investor-owned utility industry.
I can go. I'm on a webinar.
All right, go ahead. Sorry about the interruption.
It's not a problem. Just again, as an introduction, our company serve approximately 220 million Americans and operate in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. Our companies own vast overhead electric systems, including utility poles. And what I guess I would begin to start the discussion, or at least my statement around, would be that our companies are well positioned to help and to continue actually supporting broadband deployments. There's a real desire to help to close the digital divide. Just to set this up, our company's IOUs have long supported communications networks in this country. This goes back, actually, it's one of the original issues that EEI took on in the 1930s. There's been a joint use relationship that IOUs have had with ILECs that has been the joint use arrangements. Again, now providing Section 224 access through the Pole Attachment Act to cable as well as CLECs. But we're also looking for other ways to be able to leverage our infrastructure. And in more recent years, we've seen electric companies opening up access to streetlight poles. And so part of the equation is not just the wireline, but also the 5G wireless. So we're really looking also to support small cell deployments, but not just on poles that are subject to 224 regulation, but also street lighting. We see that as really key to being able to be a solution partner in closing the divide. And more recently, our companies are looking very strongly into how they can leverage their own fiber networks, not as last mile providers, let me underscore that, but as middle mile providers, so that they can really make a difference with respect to the choices that communities have for an ISP, making sure that there's actually a connection to the backbone for these unserved and underserved areas that is on a non-discriminatory basis and at reasonable rates. But one of the things we think is really key when we look at the topic at hand is to understand there's a balance of interests and to recognize that the cost impacts to customers really need to be made in a way, need to be managed in a way that allows for investment to be made equitably and fairly. So what I guess I would, take a look in terms of the topic that you asked about, Drew, with respect to the FCC, which is diving into this subject and has been looking at pole attachments actually over the last decade. We think that, again, the perspective would be that the FCC has managed to provide a policy that has really provided communications companies with a valuable and cost-based access to the poles. So we think that's actually been an approach that the FCC has been leaning into. Some of the things I think is important to add for some background in terms of investor-owned utilities. First off, our companies are heavily regulated both at the federal and the state level with respect to rates, terms, conditions, as well as the quality of service. So customer service and reliability are regulated at both levels. IOUs therefore have a very, very strong incentive to be investing in and maintaining their systems. IOUs do not compete with broadband providers, and our companies do not charge premiums for make-ready work. So the make-ready work that is done is at cost. But that also means, as I alluded to earlier, when there is not a charge, there is a cost that is not providing for full allocation, or rather, if our companies cannot recover the full cost, that is going to have a very direct impact to electric customers. And significantly for our companies, in terms of how they make a decision to make investments, it will divert capital away from what would otherwise be invested in the community for their electric system. So there's a balancing act that really has to be looked at and understood. We have definitely a different view in terms of, I think, whether pole attachment rates and make-ready charges are barriers. We don't see that. We see plenty of information out there that recognizes that low population density, as well as the high costs in unserved areas, really make the business case difficult for building out infrastructure. And that's as much is true for electric companies as it is for the communications attachers. However, we have a different model of regulation behind the electric industry. One of the things that comes to my mind when I'm thinking about this is that co-ops, cooperatives are different than IOUs, but they've actually gone out to try to incent communication providers into unserved areas by offering free pole attachments. And yet the business case hasn't been there. So that is why the funding that is now available is so key. It makes the business case now possible, it makes it very feasible and interesting. And that's why we're in fact having, I think, this discussion now.
Well, we're going to have to turn it over now to our next speaker. Let's turn to you, Edward Lopez.
Thank you, Drew, and thank you everyone for attending today. I come at this issue from the perspective of economics. I'm an economics professor. That's what I do. But I also come at it with a personal connection because I teach in a rural area in Southern Appalachia. I'm at Western Carolina University, and I see very up close and firsthand the accounts that people have, the stories that they have of not being connected, of being on the other side of the digital divide. So I have that personal interest because it affects the people in my community. But in terms of the economics that I bring to the table, really the role of economics in this issue is it has the capacity to assess the competitiveness of a market ecosystem. And in general, to get to Drew's opening point and the first speaker, John's comments, economics brings a fundamental principle forward that really is, as John mentioned, kind of pro everybody. That concept is called efficiency. Efficiency is a word that has usage in daily life, of course, but in economics, what it means is, are we getting close to maximizing the public interest? Are we promoting measurements of social welfare, not any particular interests welfare? And so that's the perspective that economics brings forward. In general, where that principle says where we have greater competitiveness in an ecosystem, we are going to have greater efficiency. In other words, that market ecosystem will pursue the public interest and social welfare more so than in a less competitive scenario. That is a way to understand the sort of fundamental reason, at least from the economics perspective, why the Telecommunications Act sets as one of the top priorities, removing barriers to competition. Now, when it comes to this particular issue of pole attachments, how does that assessment of the market ecosystem go? In some studies that I have done and worked on with Patricia Crafton, we've brought forth analysis that says this ecosystem is not as competitive as it could be. It's not pursuing the social welfare as much as it could be. And the reason in our studies show is isolated to something that is called the holdup problem. The holdup problem in economics explains how we could have such unexpectedly high costs and delays in this part of the steps towards achieving full broadband access. The holdup problem says that a particular economic actor in the ecosystem can, under certain circumstances, interrupt ongoing investments. That's the basic idea. And if you look at the recent history, we have everyone in this discussion is aware of the historically large investments that have come along in the last 2 years, not just RDOF, but also the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act. And so the investment is there. The holdup problem in economics explains how that investment can be interrupted by this less than competitive playing field. Given the brevity, and giving other panelists a turn to talk, I'll leave it there, but I also invite anyone to go to the studies that are linked in the materials for this webinar, and also to contact me if you'd like to learn more about the nitty-gritty, if you will, of this holdup problem. But moving on to the point for today, we're able to also use economics to quantify the benefits of closing the digital divide. In our studies, we use a standard textbook economic concept to measure what would be the social gain, what would be the contribution to social welfare, how much by dollar amounts would the public interest be pursued if we were to achieve full broadband access. Now, there's a lot of calculations that go into this and some modeling assumptions. I'm not going to do math today, don't worry. But the very bottom line is nationwide, the potential economic gain of full broadband expansion is on the order of $100 billion. $100 billion.
100 billion, and that's more than twice the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So we'll let that be your lead into our next speaker. Thank you so much for putting those numbers on the table. And let's turn now to Cheryl Riggs. Cheryl, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Drew, and thank you to all of the other panelists. I'm so excited to have this opportunity to talk about this important topic and work together. As thankfully I can say UTC has worked together with many of you on this topic, on this issue and other issues. And that's really what it's about. It's about collaboration, because as we've heard, and I love what I've heard, that this is just not about pole attachments. It's about so much more, and everything is connected. So, UTC, Utilities Technology Council, we've been around for about 70 plus years, trade association. Like our brother sister trade association, EEI. Our members, we serve everyone. So John, when you said pro everybody, that definitely resonated with me. We serve all types of utilities, IOUs, co-ops, munis, gas, water. And really what that simply is saying is we serve everyone, because our utilities, our members, they serve everyone. So it's very important, any issues that definitely affect utilities, the telecommunications. So when you talk about pole attachments, okay, we know that definitely there's been an increase in both, requests for pole attachments. And that's good if you look at it that, okay, that's going to result in what we're trying to do, which is to deploy broadband and make broadband affordable and accessible to everyone. However, there's a lot of rules and stipulations on the utilities to actually adhere to these requests and actually address them. So as they're trying to do this, I think what we found out, and the FCC became involved because there became disputes. Well, okay, we have to resolve these disputes. That's what their charge is. We have to close the digital divide. We have to make sure that broadband is being deployed. So that's how the FCC came about, I think, involved in this and this rulemaking. And I think if we all stick to what the charge was, which is what you all have said about the people, about making sure that broadband is deployed to underserved and unserved areas so that they can have the opportunities for all the things that come along with the benefits of having broadband and having access. So once we keep our eyes on that, I think going back to Drew's original thought or comment about, do we sit at the table together? Do we stand? Yes, we should. We absolutely should sit together because we can talk about the cost. And we know there's, like I just said, there's a lot of stipulations, regulations, there's high costs that especially are passed on to the utilities when we talk about pole replacements and attachments. However, in my opinion, and listening to our members, the cost is far greater for our society if we do not figure out ways to come up with a solution to this issue. So I have to be very cautious when I even think about, did the FCC get it right? It's unclear. I think we have to wait and we have to actually see results. We have to be able to measure what are the results based on what we were trying to do as far as the deployment of broadband to all communities, unserved and unserved. When we see that measure actually progressing, then we can actually start to say, okay, these rulemakings and our actions are resulting in what we like to see. So, I could go into, for those that may not know, some of the things that the utilities have to face and actually trying to do this. And that's just a reality. It's not saying it's on either side of the spectrum. It's just that these are the challenges. They have to process the applications for the request for the pole attachment or replacement relatively quickly, 133 to 178 days. And if they don't move quickly in their responses, then the requester is allowed to go forward and actually get a contractor. And this contractor may not necessarily be aware of all the standards and safety protocols. So that also kind of puts society or ratepayers, you and me, in a not the best situation. So
Right.
That's something to think about.
Well, wonderful. Thanks for getting that number.
Okay,
Again, great to get numbers on the table, 133 to 175 days. Let's hear from our last speaker, and then we'll dive into a discussion. That's Mark Paul. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Drew. Really appreciate Broadband Breakfast doing this panel. And as you alluded to at the beginning, polls don't always sound like the most interesting topic, but I think just hearing from the speakers already, I think people can quickly realize that polls really are important, and they really, get into the nitty gritty of broadband deployment. And so I'm so thrilled that we're doing this panel today. Before I jump into talking a little bit about polls and Charter's perspective on polls, I did just want to mention a little bit more about Charter as a company for those who are just not familiar with us. We are a broadband connectivity company and a cable operator that serves more than 31 million customers in 41 states through our brand name Spectrum. And the company offers a full range of services, including internet, TV, mobile, and voice services. Over the past 5 years, we've invested nearly $40 billion in infrastructure and technology. And this investment has allowed us to build out our network farther and farther throughout the country. And the investment has led to connecting approximately 2.5 million homes and businesses over the last 3 years. But I want to emphasize we're not resting on our past laurels. We're continuing to build out. And I think that that's really relevant to the conversation today. As an example of our current build out, we're combining approximately $1 billion in FCC RDOF funding with close to $4 billion of our own private capital to reach more than what the FCC estimates to be about 1 million unserved locations across 24 states. And that's going to amount to 100,000 miles of new network infrastructure over the next 7 years or so. So, we are building, and I say all of that not to toot our own horn, but we are really proud of that build out. But it really is to highlight why we're here today talking about poles, because utility poles really represent the backbone of our nation's broadband infrastructure, especially in rural areas. If a company like Charter and other providers can't get timely and cost-efficient access to a pole, in particular in unserved areas where are often rural communities that require getting access to many, many poles, if we can't get timely, cost-efficient access, the deployment is just delayed, plain and simple. And I think Charter in some ways tends to be a canary in the coal mine on some of these issues, because we are building out right now in so many unserved areas that we're encountering these pole issues in ways that maybe others haven't yet, but soon will. So, I can't emphasize enough how important the pole access is and how important it is to get that timely and kind of cost-efficient access. If we don't get that kind of access, deployment is delayed. And as I often say, consumers and businesses and anchor institutions like John talked about kind of get the short end of the pole, so to speak, and don't get connectivity when they need it. So we're very supportive of the FCC's rulemaking. We think it's great that the FCC is reevaluating, taking a look at the data, is going to hear from all different parties, and to try to figure out whether there is a fair allocation of costs, in particular with pole replacements. Charter's experience has been so far in many and honestly too many instances, the costs are not being shared in a fair and equitable way. But so we're really appreciative of the FCC kind of moving forward with this proceeding and taking in all the information to look at this a little bit more carefully. The one thing I will also say about the FCC proceeding, I know we're going to talk probably a lot about the replacement issue itself and costs and so forth, but I think one aspect of the FCC proceeding that nobody should gloss over is the timely resolution of disputes. I think the FCC is seeking comment about how it can improve its processes for resolving disputes, which inevitably come up, and making sure that those are resolved quickly, because I think that is so critical to getting broadband deployed quickly, and making sure government funding that is going out to support deployment gets used efficiently and has its maximum impact as quickly as possible. So maybe I'll stop there, and thank you again for having me today.
Well, wonderful. And the table truly has been set. So let's dive in. I want to turn to Edward Lopez first, because when I start to think about, hey, there's a difference of opinion here, I would love to look at, well, what does the data show? What does the economic data show? And I know in your reports, Professor Lopez, you focused on Florida, Kentucky, Missouri, Texas, Wisconsin, North Carolina. What's the focus, or what's the reason for that focus? And what do you discover? In other words, what makes one state's pole attachment rules different from or better than another state's?
So on that last point, this is the subject of my ongoing analysis. It's in the cake is in the oven, if you will, and it's not quite ready yet. Patricia Crabton and I are working on some analytics that will help us understand the impacts of state-to-state rules and practices. However, on the work that we have already completed can show something that's very, very close to what Cheryl and Mark, our last two speakers, were touching on. On the one hand, we can calculate the gains to expanding broadband and connecting people and closing the digital divide. But on the flip side of that, part and parcel with that, we're able to also calculate the costs of delayed expansion. Every month, every semester that my students are not connected continues the pattern of digital divide hardship. The studies that we've done are able to quantify that. And the bottom line to that is every month of delay nationwide brings about $500 million to 600 million, 500 million to 600 million of foregone gains to connecting people. Now, those delay costs and those foregone gains are most pronounced in the states that we focused on, Florida, Kentucky, and so forth.
So you focused on some of the worst states, for lack of a better term. Now, I'm going to introduce something none of our speakers have mentioned yet, although it's a very curious feature of the pole attachment space. And that is to say, a state can basically reverse preempt the FCC, meaning that they can say, we don't want to be governed by the FCC. So the FCC's got an ongoing proceeding, but it only governs about 24, 25, 26. I never remember what the exact count is of the states because those are the ones that have not reverse preempted the FCC. So here's another kind of economic data point, like how good are the FCC's regulations on pole attachments versus other states? And if we could get a market, if you will, for the best pole attachment rules, where would that be? I.e. in some state, or does the FCC in fact have best pole attachment rules? And let me open it up to not just Professor Lopez, but anyone to speak about this question of FCC regulations versus a particular state's regulation. Who'd like to address this question? Go ahead, Arya.
Sure. So I think, first off, you've seen more states, the trend would be more states have reversed preempted the FCC. It has gone from less to more. At the same point, I think there is kind of a conventional wisdom that a lot of the reverse preemption states actually do follow the rules that the FCC sets. So that's a kind of a mixed answer. Different states are going to be making those decisions for some different reasons. But I think one of the things I believe in talking to regulators that they're thinking about, and it goes to some of the questions in the chat box, is that the regulators in the states are looking at both the communication space and the electric space. They're thinking about the investment that's going into both of these systems because, in fact, both of these systems are providing social welfare for the people in the communities. So to the extent that we're trying to figure out what the social welfare is of closing the digital divide, which the electric industry is fully, wants to be a part of solving, the other part of this discussion is how is this diverting, how is this allocating capital within a state? How is this having an impact on the customers within a state? So different states are going to be looking at this in a different way, but I'm not so sure there's a model regulations that is winning the day at this point. There's going to be different reasons for why states have decided, for one reason or another, they want to be able to be able to work with regulation to make sure that these issues work out for their constituents.
Let me ask those who have kind of complained about the issue as a problem, right? There's a problem, there's a cost problem, there's a time problem. What in your mind is the reason driving the FCC to reopen this inquiry? And what would you like to see the FCC do to improve the cost or time problem of pole attachments? Those of you who have complained particularly about the problem. Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I guess what I would say to that, I mean, what's driving it right now is that there is a massive, build out, broadband build out. I mean, I think we've all been talking for many years about closing the digital divide. Companies like Charter, but we're not alone, are building out, extensively. And obviously with these government funding programs coming on, like the NTIA BEAD program, the existing ARPA funding, there's a lot of effort being put into building out. And so with that, increased build out, these issues like getting access to polls, sharing of costs, disputes over who owes what, it's just naturally going to bubble up. And the FCC, appropriately wants to make sure that costs are being allocated fairly. From what I said before, I think we have concerns that those costs are not being shared fairly in all instances. And so it makes sense for the FCC to kind of evaluate and make sure that broadband is getting out as quickly as possible to communities.
Mark, just very quickly, give us an example of what is not a fair share. Like why is it not shared fairly?
Yeah, no, fair enough. So in particular with the FCC, they're looking at pole replacement costs. And what Charter has found in many instances when it goes to attach to a pole owner will say, look, and I'm simplifying a bit here, but a pole owner will say, look, yeah, we can accommodate your attachment, but you're gonna need to buy us a whole new pole to get onto the pole. And we say, okay, we understand that maybe there is some cost that we need to bear for that pole, but if we buy you, a pole owner, a whole new pole, you're getting some benefit too, right? Because you're now gonna own that new pole, and you're going to charge rent, the recurring revenue for that pole. So there should be some sharing of costs here associated with that pole. And that's really at the heart of what the FCC is looking at. And what we have found in many instances, we are bearing the full cost of that new pole, and the pole owner is not bearing any cost associated with that, and that therefore increases our costs in ways that just doesn't seem fair and equitable.
Let's hear REA and Cheryl's reaction to that point, and then John, and then we'll go to you, John.
Sure. So at the outset, I would agree with Mark that is the what's driving the FCC is exactly the concerns around deployments, but when we start to dive into what's fair and equitable around a pole replacement, we necessarily do have to get a little bit more specific than what's been discussed, because in the background, the IOU is going to also likewise have to let's look a little bit more comprehensively. There's the reoccurring rate part of this discussion, and then there's the pole replacement. So there's two parts to the cost that are associated with with the deployment, with the request for access. But if a pole does not need to be replaced, and it's going to be replaced simply to accommodate an attacher's need for capacity, for a public utility, that is going to be an imprudent use of their capital. They're not going to be able to recover that cost. That's going to come right out of the electric ratepayers' pockets, and it's going to go elsewhere, so to be able to provide that discount. Those are the circumstances where the FCC's passed upon, where to the extent that there's a pole that needs to be replaced, that's going to get replaced at the cost of the IOU. Right. So the FCC does have rules in place right now that actually attend to this problem, okay, that's being described. But where it has to be, is solely being replaced for make capacity to accommodate a new attacher, to be able to not recover that cost means that the IOU is in fact going to take a loss on their capital investment, and they're going to have to divert funds from what would otherwise go into the community. So this is some of the equity issues that come up behind what is an arcane issue around a pole replacement. Drew, go ahead.
Sorry. Well, that's great, Cheryl. Let's hear from you. And again, because we have so many people and we have such a limited time, I ask you to please be brief, but maybe address someone's got to bear the cost. What's wrong with the utilities bearing the cost? If I were to ask it that directly, Cheryl, do you want to address that? And then I want to hear from John too on the.
I'll try my best. UTC and utilities, they support broadband access, always have. Utilities replace poles to promote broadband access, even when they don't have to. They have under Section 224, they don't have to. They've done that, and they're going to continue to do this. But I just want to say that we talk about the FCC, maybe if we could encourage to get away from some of the heavy-handed regulatory solutions and instead try to develop ways to work together. at UTC, we see even everywhere, middle mile, last mile, utilities, people are working together to actually come up with a solution. And I really think we can do that. And to what REA said, if it's going to come down to the utilities and then it's going to just flow to the ratepayers, then have we really resolved the issue of deploying broadband to unserved areas or underserved areas? We have to ask ourselves, because there's a lot of things working here. You know, it's not just who bears the cost of replacing the pole when it doesn't need to be replaced or has not been identified, red tagged, that it needs to be replaced. I mean, there's labor shortages, there's escalating costs, supply chain challenges. All of these are issues. And then, of course, from a utility perspective, there's safety, security, and reliability that must be maintained. There has to be a standard. So when we talk about deploying and doing this quickly, we have to think about all of those things, because if we do it too quickly and there's standards that we have not followed and safety is at risk, once again, we have to ask ourselves, have we done what we were intending to do? Or did we just try to put a patch on a temporary solution? I think our utilities have proven time and time again that they are trying to come up with the long-term solution that is safe, reliable, affordable, and accessible for all. They're public servants that's serving everyone.
John, I know you've wanted to chime in for a little bit here. Go ahead, John.
Yes, thank you, Drew. So I did want to offer a couple of quick thoughts. First, in terms of sharing the cost of replacing the pole, I think it's pretty clear the cost shouldn't only be on the last attacher. That wouldn't be fair. But it's also not fair to say that all of the costs should be on the pole owner either, because you have to recognize that the pole has value and you can charge fees and get some compensation for the use of that pole that should play into the economic analysis. Now, I'm not an economist, so forgive me, but I do know there's a concept of depreciation. And, perhaps that's also a concept that should be folded into the calculation of what's a fair compensation to the pole owner. So the depreciated rate rather than the full cost of a new rate should be in the mix. But the other main point I want to make is I really appreciate Cheryl's recognition and desire to work together collaboratively to solve this issue. And I think in particular, Cheryl, I think you recognize that there is an issue here. And that's hindering broadband deployment. I think, taking the position that we don't see any effect on broadband deployment, the pole attachments policies have no impact on the pace of broadband. I don't think that's a tenable position. So I would love to work with you, Cheryl, going forward to try to craft some sort of comprehensive collaborative proposal to fix these problems.
Let me come back to Edward, the economist here, and ask you to react to these points that have been raised, the last attacher, depreciation, et cetera. But let me throw another question in the mix, which is to say, is cost the problem or is delays the problem? Is there any way to get quantitatively at which is, because you can see obviously, time is money in a very real sense. And if we're trying to get more deployment sooner, we're going to have problems if we have time delays. So what's your economist lens on the cost and time question, as well as these other points?
Well, delay creates costs. So in some sense, they're part and parcel of each other. We also have to look at the various senses in which the word cost can be used. So there is the attacher's cost of attaching. There is the pole owner's cost of maintaining on all the margins that Cheryl mentioned, safety and reliability and so forth and so on. And I think that the FCC's priority, as I understand it, has come out and said, what is the most efficient and equitable way of sharing these costs? It's important to get this right for the various reasons that have been identified so far, including the contribution that I've made. The longer it goes, the longer the delay in attaching, and connecting folks to broadband, the larger the social costs are. Just to finish the point, I think it's important not to, and this discussion is doing a really, really good job of that, not to treat this as a binary issue. It's not an either or type of problem. There's not a finger being pointed here, certainly not by the economic analysis. It is an assessment of how competitive is the market ecosystem here. And I think that we have to, and the FCC has to think of this in shades of degree. To what extent can either set of parties here exercise market power, a degree of market power, in order to promote their own as opposed to the social interests? That's the fundamental question. It's not a binary one. And we have to sort of look at the gritty information in order to get a handle on that. These are some of the things that Patricia Crabden and I are working on now.
We always have lots of questions teed up in the chat window. I'm sorry, we won't be able to get all of them, but like just two, let me combine. Alice Lawson asks thoughts on the fair allocation of costs and regulation when it comes to poll owners and poll users. And that maybe ties into another point that Bruce Wolf raised, which is to say, is there some logic in which there's a municipalization of public ownership of these polls? Already, obviously, municipalities do have a major role in poll ownership in certain places. But let's speak specifically about this point about public ownership through cities or other public entities. Not necessarily public utilities, but public entities, and all of the panel's thoughts on whether that's a development we're going to see more and should see more of. You got to unmute yourself, Cheryl. All right.
Well, Drew, I could take a quick stab to get things started. First, I do want to applaud the city of Seattle for taking a very proactive approach in using the fees that they collect from poll attachments into a digital equity fund to help promote digital equity. I think most cities don't do that, but the city of Seattle does, and that's to their credit. In terms of sharing the costs, I do want to add one other component that funding should be made available to help the poll owners in those cases where it's uneconomic both to deploy broadband, but also it's an added cost for the utility. There may be sort of a win-win just by providing some funding. I think what confused us at Shelby is that we went to some electric co-ops and said, well, how about this Texas law that sets up a fund to compensate the poll owners for their costs? Wouldn't that be a good idea? And the electric utilities rejected that idea. That even providing them the funding wasn't sufficient. So that's the kind of thing that confuses us as we try to search for a solution. We're hoping everybody will pull together to solve the problem.
It doesn't sound like some confusion so much as the holdup problem, right? That Edward Lopez raised earlier. Mark, do you want to add in on that?
Yeah, I guess all I was going to say is echo what John was saying. It seems that with so much funding, putting that is out there, federal and state funding towards broadband, towards other infrastructure needs, that does possibly stand out there, poll replacement funds or something like that. In Texas, as John said, is kind of a unique solution to this issue. But it is odd that in certain places, like John is saying, that certain electric utilities were not receptive to that. But
if I could just make a comment.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Right. So I will say that we did, in fact, as EEI, make the suggestion to NTIA that we thought that NTIA funds could be used for pole replacements. And if you want to try to get to kind of places where we could be agreeing upon it, which would be, there is, we all agree this is vital. It's part of the backbone. We get that. But I don't think we entirely agree that in the present circumstances that it's a pure public good, right? So the idea would be, how do you actually get to that? How do you get to that? How do you get to a world where electric ratepayers are also broadband customers, right? Which is kind of what we're trying to do in terms of closing the gap. What we're going to need to have is, I think, a more comprehensive conversation around is what the public utility model is, and again, what our concerns are in terms of cost shifting, with, in fact, broadband providers who have really the same challenge, which is making the business case to be able to deploy into these areas. And so to round it back out, and just to make sure you understand, I did take a look at Shelby's principles. I think there's things we could talk about at the principle level where we might not agree entirely on how to do it, but we should have a conversation around that. And so I will say EEI would be very willing to engage with Shelby and others around principles, but we got to really, again, recognize what are the respective regulatory backgrounds and what is really guiding investment decisions to try to make this work. So we would be very interested in those types of discussions going forward. And we also likewise would say, don't think it's purely an FCC solution. We think there's a lot to be done at the state level, and we'd be very interested in having that discussion as well.
I want to get two more quick issues in before we go to kind of some final thoughts that everyone could offer very, very briefly. First off, does IIJA specifically do anything to help this issue? And I know, REA, you referred to your comments. I want to just see if others have comments on that. And that's an open question. And two, wireless providers and their role in this issue. Obviously, they need backhaul too, so they need pole attachments in that sense. But are there different issues with attaching wireless facilities on poles? And again, this may be a can of worms we can't address in the conclusion of this, but I just want to see if those on the panel have thoughts on those two questions, IIJA and wireless attachments.
Yeah, I mean, I think to the extent that IIJA, influences this discussion, I think it is in terms of money being devoted to broadband and build out, which is, accentuates a lot of the issues that we're talking about. As to whether there are specific sections of IIJA on poles and so forth, I don't believe that's the case, although maybe I'm forgetting something.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in here on that, because we have had conversations with NTIA, and they have told us that pole attachment costs are an eligible expense for BEAD funding. So you can ultimately, it goes through the states, but the funding should be eligible, the pole attachment costs should be eligible for reimbursement. Now, I think the danger could be, however, that pole owners, knowing that the money is out there, could have an incentive to start raising their rates, which would, of course, not go in the right direction. So that's something also to be cautious about. When Shelby held a webinar a year or so ago, one of the representatives of the electric co-op said that on average, their rates are twice as high for pole attachments as the regulated rates. So there is an incentive for unregulated entities to increase their rates to suboptimal levels.
We are running out of time. I'm going to give everyone 30 seconds to add anything else you'd like, and we'll go in the reverse of the order we started in. So that means you get to start, Mark.
Okay. No, I really appreciate this opportunity to talk today. I guess the one thing that I want to say is, we've talked a little bit about, and some have mentioned about cost shifting. And I do want to make clear that broadband providers are certainly not trying to cost shift or get a freebie, get onto poles for free. We are definitely going to pay our fair share. We understand that. I think what's at issue at the FCC proceeding is really evaluating whether we are in fact paying our fair share, or whether broadband providers have in fact been paying far more than their fair share. So,
all right, thank you, Cheryl.
Sure.
All right, thank you so much for this opportunity to be a part of this. Thank you, Drew, and to all our panelists. And John, let's all work together, and let's work together even with people, share the word with others that are not here, because at the end of the day, it comes down to people, like we all have said. We want to make sure that people have access to broadband. And it's, yes, the cost issue is not something that we could just today say it's A or B. It is very complex, and that we will have to have many conversations. Like REI said with EEI, we've got to get others involved beyond the FCC. Our members are everywhere. We're everywhere. And we talk about ratepayers quite often, and hardly ever do we ever hear from ratepayers. So we need to get them involved, educated, and in conversations as well, so that they can provide insight and input. But thank you.
All right, let's go to Edward Lopez.
Competitiveness in this ecosystem is key to pursuing the public interest. We don't want to abandon the profit motive as a mechanism for pursuing the public interest.
Thank you for being brief. REA.
Sure. So thanks very much for including me in this conversation. We think that, again, the conversation should be moving towards trying to provide business certainty for poll owners. We think that there should be a number of different discussions along the lines of how we can, in fact, reduce disputes. I think one of the key aspects you mentioned is time, and that is really super important to getting deployments out there. But again, we think that this is more than just an FCC conversation, and we would be happy to engage with folks on this panel as well as others in terms of trying to come up with solutions.
Thank you, REA. John, we'll give you the last word. Thank you for being with us, each of you. Go ahead, John.
Great. Well, I do want to accept Alice's clarification in the chat that I misspoke when I said about the Digital Equity Fund in Seattle. It's funded by cable franchise fees, not by poll attachments. So thank you, Alice, for clarifying. But my overall last point is I really want to appreciate Cheryl and REA for being willing to talk to Shelby about our principles going forward. I'd love to take you up on that. Thank you.
Well, that brings us to the end of the hour at 1 o'clock Eastern time. Thank you for being with us. A reminder to please register to attend Digital Infrastructure Investment. It's in Houston, but you can watch it for free if you register at broadbandbreakfast.com/DII for Digital Infrastructure Investment. On behalf of our great panel, John Winhausen, REA Fishman, Edward Lopez, Cheryl Riggs, and Mark Paul, I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. We'll see you next week.